Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Welcome to another episode of the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and today we have our special guest, Justin, back. Hi, Justin.
Hello. Thank you for having me, Matt.
Thank you for coming on again, Justin. Justin Williams is a fellow mineral owner. Today we're going to talk a little bit about leasing. I get a lot of questions from some of my consulting clients and podcast listeners, and this is probably one of the most common questions. And Mike had written in and asked the question. He said, my siblings and I received an offer to lease minerals on half a section we own in Weld County, Colorado. How do we evaluate the terms of the offer, and what should we negotiate for? So today we're going to talk a little bit about leasing and what are some of the most common lease terms to be aware of, and sort of leasing 101, and what you should negotiate for with those specific terms. And again, this may vary state to state, so this is sort of a general overview. Think of it as a 20,000 foot view. What are the basics you should know? As always, we would recommend contacting a lawyer or a landman to get more specialized help, someone that's familiar with your county and your state and what the trends are. So, Justin, have you run into this particular issue in the past?
Absolutely. And, this is a wonderful problem to have, because as things heat up in the oil and gas market, more of a leasing becomes more active. And I actually woke up this morning to a lease offer from a company on a property that we have been working with Shell. So in this scenario, we're going to have two different companies that may actually be competing against each other on the lease, which competition is always a good problem to have. I know for mineral rights owners, though, and I know for myself, when I receive a leasing offer, it's your head explodes a little bit, because it's a huge packet of papers. It's full of legal jargon, and you have no idea what to do. And there's so many things to be careful of, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. That's a good, like you said, a good problem to have. You have a lease offer sitting in your inbox, and you have multiple offers, which is, we'll talk about a little bit to start with, that, some of the considerations that I've found that will dictate how much bargaining power you have. It really, like you said, supply and demand is a huge one. So if you have multiple companies that are actively leasing in that area, that's good for mineral owners, because they're wanting to secure that land position, and they're going to potentially be willing to pay you a little bit more from a lease bonus standpoint, or give you a little more favorable terms just so that they can secure that land. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about, I know without specifics, maybe some of the two offers you've gotten, and sort of have you seen that already in your area?
No, so this is actually the first time that we've seen the two offers come in on this property, and it just seems to be something that has been heating up over the last few months. Now it's come down to them kind of competing on the leasing bonus, and also some of the terms of the actual lease itself and the duration of it. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where it goes. I know when talking with other people with leasing, something they don't often realize is the leasing bonus is really just a small portion of it. If they're limiting the depth, if they're doing other things in the lease, you really have to pay attention, because that huge leasing bonus you're receiving up front may be for a reason within the terms.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's only the icing on the cake, as I like to call it. I mean, I think, to your point, the actual terms of the lease are, in the long run, potentially more important, especially if you have a large land position, in terms of the net mineral acres. It's just a 1% difference in the royalty rate or the cost provisions will have a significant impact. And we'll talk about those specifically in more detail. Just to wrap up in terms of supply and demand, I think one of the things that you want to consider is, if you do have a large tract in terms of the net mineral acres, you're going to have a lot more bargaining power than someone that maybe if you have 1 or 2 acres. So if that is the case, and the other thing too is that the potential outcome could be significant from a legacy standpoint. So if your family, has several hundred net mineral acres and an active shale play, you can help really set yourself up, your family up, with a really nice legacy, financially, if you do it right. And so that's where you want to get that extra help from a lawyer to review the terms so you know exactly what you're going to be signing and that you get what you expect there.
And that's a great point, man. And I don't think a lot of people realize, I know I did not when I first started looking into this, when you sign a lease, like you mentioned, that is a legacy thing. That lease could last for the next 25, 30 to 40 years, and people don't necessarily realize that when they're getting into leasing with a company. That is a long duration, and kind of on that, we'll get into the top points, and I think one that just kind of makes sense, but people don't consider it or don't realize how important it is make sure it's in writing. If they're talking to you about changes they're going to make to your lease, it doesn't matter unless it's actually in writing on that lease.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the biggest thing. They can promise the world, over the phone, but unless you have it in the actual lease agreement and an email too, potentially, in most cases too, that's always a good thing. If you have it in writing in some form or fashion is what you want to do. I want to ask you, Justin, what are some of the resources you've gone to, find that kind of information out? I mean, I know I've seen on Mineral Rights Forum, again, I go back to that as being a good resource for mineral owners, at least in understanding what companies may be offering to other people in your area, and specifically, again, by county, it could vary greatly depending on the location. One township to another, you'll have a significantly different terms, depending on the activity level. But what have you found as a good resources that have helped you in navigating the lease?
So Mineral Rights Forum is absolutely the number one place that I found to be the most useful for me as far as comparing what leasing bonuses are kind of going on in the area. The Mineral Rights Forum does a really great job of having people get on there, kind of post what's going on and different people asking questions. I've also found finding one or two people that you really can trust as an advisor, like a financial advisor, on oil and gas is a great thing, whether it's an oil and gas attorney or whether it's a great landman that you work with. They really are just much more in tune than the average mineral right owner will be.
Okay, well, thanks. That helps. So the next thing, once you do get that offer in the mail or on the email or however you receive it, you want to do some due diligence. So research who you're dealing with. And the thing that you can do is as simple as doing a Google search about, that company name that is wanting to lease your property. If it's a large oil and gas company, like you mentioned, Shell, that's pretty a reputable company. They're going to be there for in the long run. They're not a fly-by-night operator. But some of the other things you want to look at is you can kind of figure out, and some of these oil and gas companies do try to hide their identity at the beginning of in an exploration play, especially if there's an area that is primarily unleased and they don't want to let the cat out of the bag that maybe they're planning on going in big in that area and leasing up a bunch of land and drilling. So they may come in with another company that is just a land contract, basically contract landmen or landwomen that are out there knocking on doors and sending out letters on behalf of that company. So they'll sign the lease. So you may sign a lease with a company, that is some, XYZ Land Solutions or something like that, that it's not apparently, clear who's going to be the operator for the well if it should be drilled. Reputable company will be willing to tell you, or at least kind of give you a hint as to who it is. So that's something you should ask for is, hey, who are you leasing on behalf of, or who are you planning on assigning this lease to? Especially if you own the surface rights as well. So you want to know that you're going to have somebody that's going to come in on your land and do the right thing, from an environmental perspective and clean up after themselves and stuff like that. And so that's an important bit, is to do that due diligence. And that should factor into how you negotiate the lease. So if you have a reputable, well-known operator, proven history, you might be willing to bend a little bit more than someone that is just brand new on the block and that you've never heard of, because you just don't know what you're gonna get at the end of the day. They can assign it to anybody, and that could happen with these large companies as well. They may assign the lease to somebody else. So that's something to consider. Absolutely.
And I think to that effect, Matt, something as well to consider is when someone is signing a lease with you, the company is taking the legal obligation to drill a well in a certain time frame, or at least to do some work on that land. And you got to be sure, is it a company that seems like they have the funds and the resources to do so? Because you get the leasing bonus, but if they don't produce the oil, you don't get the royalty rate.
That's right. If they drill in that time period, just to add on to that, they are obligated to those terms that you agree to. Like you said, you get the lease bonus, but if you expect that a well is going to be drilled and it's just because you lease the property doesn't always mean a well is necessarily going to get drilled within the primary term of that lease. And that's a thing that you may hear about, is that primary term is the time frame from when you sign that lease to when well is drilled, basically. And there's generally a term of, a couple, either 3 to 5 years is probably as long as you'd want to go on that. I've seen in some cases people get bit by signing, like a 10-year lease. And in that case, your land is tied up. That company can sit back and not do anything until that 9th year, or even let it lapse. And if you have an extension, some of them will have an option to extend the lease to pay you another bonus. Sometimes it's more than the initial bonus. Just because it's more, it doesn't mean that's a good thing. So if you have for example, a 3-year lease with an option to extend for another 3 years, and they're going to pay you 150% of that initial lease bonus amount, that may sound really good at the time, but if you happen to lease for a low initial bonus, that 150% is going to be a lot less than some of your neighbors may be getting, in that 4 or whatever, when they're going to try to release their land if they didn't have an option to extend. So what I always tell people is if you can lease it for, that primary term of 3 to 5 years, depending on kind of what the going rate is in your area, and limit the option period to as short as possible. Ideally, it's non-existent. So it's a 3-year primary term and that's it. It ends after that 3rd year, so that you have the option to renegotiate a lease for hopefully better terms at that point if there's a lot of activity going on. So that's something to think about as well.
Absolutely. Another thing too, and this kind of goes back to competitive advantage and even more information that's useful for you, but researching activity near your property. If somebody's contacting you for a lease, somebody obviously sees some opportunity in your property, but there may be other people working near, around it, or close to it as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think and there's a lot of really good resources on the internet. Most state oil and gas commissions, and in the case of Texas, the Texas Railroad Commission, they have online maps where you can go and look at nearby activity. So you can locate your property on the map based on the legal description. And then a lot of them have an overlay. You can show the township and section and range, or in Texas, the league and labor and block. And you can pinpoint where your property is and see where wells have recently been permitted. And you can kind of look at the surrounding area in that township or in that section and see who's actively leasing, who's drilling. That's important, especially if you're out of state and you don't have eyes on the ground. You don't see a drilling rig driving down the county road, and that there is activity going on that way. But you're out of state. Maybe you've inherited minerals. You don't exactly know what's going on. Go to the internet. You can research the heck out of your property and figure out what's going on, and that'll help you in the negotiation, because then you'll know, hey, how much competition are they going to have? Is there something that, in Justin's case, or maybe he's gotten a couple of lease offers unintentionally or kind of unrequested. You can actually go and pursue an additional a competing lease offer if you get one in the mail and you say, this is interesting, and you see there's other companies that are actively leasing as well. Wouldn't hurt to go and proactively contact those other companies to see if they'd be interested in leasing your land, and then getting that competition going. And then when you tell the landman, hey, I've got another offer on the table, generally they're going to sharpen their pencil. They're not going to give you their lowest offer. They say, okay, well, if they have another offer, I know kind of what other companies are offering. I'm going to give them a little bit more because we want to lease that property. So that's another thing that is a helpful resource out there.
And, when you're getting into the leasing, no two leases are alike. They all have their things. They all have their clauses from different people, and you have to really carefully read them. And I think, it's super important to get an attorney involved in this process and actually have them look the lease over. But it's good for mineral right owners to have some idea, too, what to watch for. And these are some of the biggest things that can really cause a headache.
Yeah, and those lease provisions are key. And the thing that's interesting, you'll see the standard form. They say, "Oh, this is our standard." Sometimes it'll show Producers 88. Well, in my experience, there's not very many Producers 88 forms, which is a paid-up oil and gas lease form that is identical. So just because it says Producers 88, that doesn't mean that it's the standard and best offer that's going to potentially come across your desk. The operators will take that standard form and then make changes to it to fit their needs. And so you really do have to go clause by clause, like Justin mentioned, and understand what the pros and cons are of the wording in there. And I think really the only way to do that, unless you have a legal background and you are familiar with the terminology and the law, it's worth the money to hire somebody to help you with this. We're going to go through just a few of the most common clauses or the most important clauses to look out for and what to consider. There are many more that you should be aware of and understand, and we'll cover those in another episode. Our plan is to bring on an attorney, oil and gas attorney, to help navigate that and to get into more depth about specific state laws and regulations as it relates to leasing. But I'll start out with and just talk about the primary term, since you mentioned that already, Justin. As I mentioned, you want to keep that as short as possible. Really, that primary term is important because it sets the time frame for which the operator must drill a well or commence drilling operations in order for that lease to stay in effect. Let's say you have a primary term of 3 years. It'll have some wording in there about what does commencing drilling operations mean in terms of the lease. So a lot of times it'll say, operations shall include operations for the drilling of a new well and operations for the reworking, deepening, plugging back of a well, or other operations conducted in an effort to establish, resume, or reestablish production. So it's very general. And so it's a lot of times, building a well pad will be considered commencing drilling operations depending on how it's worded. So, and as long as they're continuously prosecuting those operations without a gap of, and it'll have a gap in there, usually about 120 days, that'll be deemed to have commenced. And so they could, on that last day when that lease primary term's almost about to end, they begin the construction of the well site location or the road, which provides access. They could be just, depending on the terms of that lease, considered, okay, they've started and that lease is still in effect. And as long as they keep moving forward on drilling that well, that's something that will keep that lease alive. Now, the other side of that coin is that third year, you come up to that deadline, you don't have an option to extend. That primary term ends. At that point, your lease will be what they call released. So they're releasing it, they're giving it back. So at that point, you are open to leasing your land again. So that's again, depending on the activity level. If their activity level is picking up, that's a good place to be in, because then you can potentially negotiate better terms. So.
Absolutely. And I think to that effect, too, something to realize is that it's in the oil and gas company's best interest to try to keep a lease active as long as they can. Anytime they can keep a lease active without having to repay the bonuses, that's in their best interest for it from a business standpoint. So that's something they're going to try to do.
Definitely, yeah. And if they, you'll hear a term that we'll talk about a little bit as it relates to, the different ways that they can keep those leases active, but you hear a lease that's held by production. So that means a well has been drilled on that property that was leased, and it's producing, and therefore that lease is then going to be in effect as long as that production continues. And there's some provisions that we won't really go into depth today, but there's things that are covered in the Producers 88 form around shut-in provisions. So it'll talk about if they shut in the well, for a certain period of time, what their obligations are under the lease. Often it's a pretty small amount, $1 per year per net mineral acre. People a lot of times get hung up on that shut-in provision. You can negotiate a little bit higher amount per net mineral acre, but oftentimes a lot of the other terms of the lease will be more important, because at the point where this becomes an issue is if, hopefully at the end of the life of those wells, when things are, maybe they're intermittently producing them, or they can't produce them continuously because of operational reasons, they may shut them in for a while and then turn them back on. But so as long as they're meeting the shut-in royalty provisions, then that lease will still be active. So that's another one to just be aware of. And they can't do that forever. So again, the other thing, the more important thing, in my opinion, is the time period for which they can make those shut-in royalty payments. A lot of times it's 2 years is the max. And so at that point, that lease will terminate. If they've been in that mode for 2 years, they can't just keep on maintaining it and forced by the payment of shut-in royalties. They have to release it. But that all boils down to getting an attorney to know, hey, this is what this means. If you have it's worded this way, this is how long they can pay you shut-in royalty payments and so forth. So yeah, that's kind of another thing to think about.
And this is becoming, I see this happening more so in Loving County in Texas now, because it is becoming such an area that is, the price per acre for bonuses is becoming higher and higher. Companies are really trying hard to put in an option where they can extend their lease by a few years so that they continue trying to produce. And if you want to talk a little bit about the option to extend leases, this is something that's becoming common in some areas.
Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, I think that they will typically offer you an option to extend as part of their initial offer, sort of what I've seen. So you may get, and it's not a bad thing necessarily, especially if you are on the fringes and you think that maybe I have a while before something's going to get drilled. You've done your due diligence, like we talked about. A 3-year primary term with a 2-year extension is not terrible. If you get a good lease bonus again, especially that first lease bonus is good, and the terms of the lease are good, that option to extend is not as big of an issue. It's if you're in an area maybe that doesn't have a lot of activity and the terms of the lease or the royalty rate is not great, then you probably would want to limit the extension. So it kind of just depends on the situation. It could be a good thing. Maybe you get a top dollar lease bonus and the lease terms are good. You've had an attorney review it. They say, yeah, this is the best we've seen in this area. We think you should, we recommend that this is, probably something as best as you're going to get. Then having an extension is not a terrible thing. That could actually not hurt you, and you wouldn't have to worry about necessarily having to try to shop your minerals around to get another lease. At the end of that, you'd have the option at least out there. So that, may or may not be extended. So that's the other thing too, is they may say, we're not focusing on this area right now. We're not going to extend it. We're going to let it lapse. And so it's not always something that's going to happen too. So that's something to think about. And to
kind of play devil's advocate there, the downside to having an extension would be that if they get into an area and they start producing and they find that it's a hugely valuable area with a huge reserve, if you've agreed to an extension, you may find that you could release that property for a much larger leasing bonus than you originally did. And that would be the reason that you want to kind of watch the duration and be sure that it's not too terribly long.
Exactly.
The other thing that people get into is the royalty clause. And I think this is something that a lot of times people overlook way more than they should, because the leasing bonus is great. And sometimes we can be kind of star-studded by that big number that you see up front. But over time, and as far as the legacy goes, the royalty rate really is what's going to matter at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think speaking from the value of your property, to sort of lock in the value, if you're in an area they're drilling wells and, getting a good lease with a royalty clause that is competitive will help ensure that you get top dollar should you decide to sell your minerals down the road. So I'll talk a little bit about the perspective from a mineral buyer as well. Is as we evaluate properties, we look at what royalty revenue we're going to receive from, if we were to purchase that property, and a direct correlation between the royalty rate and then your net revenue interest. And so the lower the royalty rate, the lower your net revenue interest and the lower your royalty payments will be. And so the higher that royalty is, oftentimes you're better off, even if you take a slightly lower lease bonus amount up front, because like Justin mentioned, there's a tremendous amount of upside. There's also a downside, which you're sort of hedging with that lease bonus, and you get some money, should a well be drilled and it's a dry hole, let's say, it means it's not capable of producing in commercial quantities, and they plug it and abandon it, and they say, well, we're not going to drill any other wells in that area for a while. You have something up front with the lease bonus, but should that there be a successful well on the upside, having a decent royalty clause will really pay off in the long run, so to speak. So typically between 12.5% and 25%. 12.5% is not a good royalty rate. I'll just say that up front. That's typically, most states have that as a minimum, that legal minimum that companies have to pay. I would be hesitant to sign a lease that had a royalty rate of 12.5%, just because they could force pull you and they're going to be obligated typically to pay you at least that. So that's something to think about. You're going to want to try to shoot between 18 and 3/4 and 25%. That's kind of more commonplace nowadays, and especially in hot areas. And again, 18%, 15%, it may not be a bad lease in an area that's got no history of oil and gas production and that is really on the exploration kind of wildcat side of things. That may not necessarily be a bad lease, but if you're in the Permian, let's say, or in the DJ Basin, and you get a 12.5% lease, I would run away from that, or at least counter with 25%. And again, this is where doing your research on Mineral Rights Forum or talking to your neighbors and understanding what kind of terms they're getting can help you. Because if your neighbor got 20%, well, that's a data point. Again, there's a lot of other variables there, other things to consider as to whether they've maybe given some room in other areas to get that higher royalty. But in general, that 20%, you could say, oh, that's a good data point. I'm going to maybe counter with 25% with my target of being at least 20. So again, this is a business negotiation. You should treat it as such. And so you need to equip yourself with the knowledge of what the other offers are out there and what you're willing to accept and kind of your goals personally and financially. So.
Absolutely. And I think something to consider in this and to keep in mind is the oil companies, when they're going out and drilling a property, they obviously see a value. And nowadays they send out geologists, they send out technology to check these things and to be sure that the money they're spending is not completely risk. So really pay attention to that royalty rate, because it is what's going to make that legacy. Another thing that I know I see a ton, and I've seen this a lot in properties in Texas and other places as well, is the post-production clause. What costs can they take from you from producing that oil and gas, which can make a huge difference in the net royalties that you receive at the end of the day.
Yeah, I totally agree there. I think this is something where you probably want to spend even more time negotiating this clause than you would, potentially the others that we've already talked about, the primary term, option to extend, or the royalty. Because if they have free reign, the way that it's worded, they'll include language that allows them to deduct cost from your royalty payments, including things like marketing, transportation, treating, dehydrating gas, compressing, processing. The list goes on. And all those things are taking money out of your pocket at the end of the day, more, because all they're doing is passing the costs on to you effectively. So that is something where, and this is where we'll have a lawyer dig into this a little bit more, because they've enforced some of the deductions when the issue has gone to the courts, if there's kind of been questionable language, so it can go either way. So case law will be important, I think, in your state, and we'll have an attorney get on here and talk about that. But the thing that you would try to shoot for here, the goal I'll just talk about, is to get language in there that requires the royalties be free of both production and post-production costs, and include language that bases the royalty payment that you receive on the actual proceeds that the company receives at the point of sale in an arm's length transaction. So in other words, if it's, their subsidiary and they're maybe they're somehow passing the costs on in a funny way through the subsidiary. The way that you have to word it there is, and it's got to be an arm's length transaction. It can't be somebody that's connected to them financially. So what they would have received in that type of a scenario versus, at the wellhead, because if you get paid at the wellhead, they still got to send that to a gas plant, and they got to do all those things I mentioned around, treating it, dehydrating it, compressing, processing, and getting it in a marketable form at that hub, the local hub that you have where they're selling gas. So, and if a company won't budge on those cost-free provisions, at least the limit your damages scenario here is to limit it to a certain percentage per MCF of gas or per barrel of oil produced, so that at least you're not going to go above that. I've had a situation where I didn't, negotiate a lease, and then there's some overrides that I have that over time those deductions have crept up to the point where they're significant, and they have a significant impact on the royalty that we receive. And so this is something that you want to really focus on.
Absolutely. And I think this is also something that if you have a multiple offer situation, or if you're dealing with more than one company in a leasing situation, this should be something that you really look at in comparing the companies as well. This will kind of tell you how the company wants to do business and how it's going to be from that point forward. I know in my experience, sometimes you pick your battles with the oil and gas companies, and once you are in a contractual agreement with them, it's a little too late. So you really want to consider these things up front and be careful of them.
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, and I think the other thing to think about, there's kind of the next kind of subject will split up into two, and it's really the severance clauses. So this is where you maybe have heard the term of a pew clause, and then there's a depth clause. And so we'll talk about those two. In the first one, the pew clause. And before we talk about that, it really kind of helps to take a step back and talk about what pooling is. Well, pooling, that concept involves combining a lease with other leases so that they make up enough acreage to create a unit according to whatever state's Oil and Gas Commission regulations, that they'll have spacing orders, let's say, for that section or sections, and they'll say this is how many wells can be drilled in that area, and this is how big that unit is. And what that means is that allows them to have a bunch of small leases that they can group together, especially now that they're drilling horizontal wells. And the reason this becomes important is because that allows them to place your acreage into that oil and gas unit, and for operations to occur on any part of that pooled unit, that'll be considered as operations under the leased premises, so that'll hold your lease. So even if the well surface location isn't physically on your property, your lease may be held by a well that's a mile away. That could be where the well has been drilled from a surface location, from a well pad that's a mile away. It's a horizontal well that extends under your property, and so that's very common now with horizontal drilling. And so that pew clause is important because if you have acreage that is, maybe you have a large tract of land that might span multiple units. If you don't have a pew clause, let's say you only have an acre in a particular pooled unit, and you could have, you have the rest of it, 319 acres. Let's say you own a half section, 319 acres and just kind of out there, not part of a pooled unit. That whole 320 acres could be held by a well you're only getting paid on that one net acre that's part of that unit. So you're then stuck. You can't release the other 319 in that scenario because it's being held by a well or wells that are part of another unit that only a fraction of your minerals are part of. So that's probably the biggest time when you really need to worry about that. If you have a small interest, have a small acreage, maybe less of an issue. If you have multiple, the other thing I'll mention is if you have multiple tracts that they try to lease under one lease, it's best to break those up if you have different legal descriptions for so you have one over in section 23 and then one over in section 19. Best practice is to get two separate leases, so then you don't even have to worry about that pew situation. So that's where you want to split the leases if you own those multiple tracts that aren't adjoining. So that's a good tip there to watch out for.
Absolutely. And I think a good rule of thumb for mineral rights owners as well is to, 90% of the time you're going to be looking at one lease, one document, one sell per legal description. If any time they're using more than one legal description in any kind of contractual obligation, it's something to look at extremely carefully.
Yeah, exactly.
The next thing is that depth clauses, and this is something that I see really started becoming more popular in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and it has continued on today, where they limit down to 7,000 feet, 8,000 feet below the ground, or sometimes you'll even see where they name a certain formation.
Yeah, and that's, I think you mentioned where, you're in Loving County, Texas. I think I've seen this a lot in Texas. You may have certain parts of West Texas. Maybe they're producing from the Grayburg Formation. The Wolf Camp is below that, but maybe the lease has a provision in there that it's limited to just the Grayburg. This is beneficial as a mineral owner because if you have a depth clause there, you can limit the depth that a well holds. So again, in that scenario I mentioned, say somebody drills a vertical Grayburg well, or maybe you have a well, you're fortunate and it has a lease that was signed back by one of your predecessors, and you have a producing well, and that does have that depth provision. Well, in today's unconventional plays, there are all these multiple formations that are stacked up on top of each other, like that Wolf Camp, like I mentioned, and companies are coming in now and drilling horizontal wells at those lower depths. Well, in that situation, if you have that depth clause, you're open to lease the lower depths to somebody else. So I've seen that before, and that's beneficial as a mineral owner because then you can get top dollar for those future lower formations that may be explored in down the road. And so again, there's a lot of different ways this can be sliced and diced, no pun intended, but you can have in there about specific formations, certain depth below the stratigraphic equivalent of the deepest producing formation or the deepest drilled depth, or it can get real complicated quickly. But another one to think about, especially if you're in an area where there is maybe some multiple formations, different depths that are being drilled. So something to think about.
Absolutely. And from an investment standpoint, a great way to utilize your property, because throughout the history of oil and gas, it's always been a case of they can drill so deep. They move on to different formations. Then new technology comes around and they can drill deeper in different ways, gather more oil. So keep that in mind. And it's something that just because they're drilling at 7,000 today, in 10 years, they may want to go to 20,000 feet and there may be new formations there.
Yeah, exactly. You never know. We're finding new stuff all the time. Yeah. So just to wrap it up, I think, again, like we've talked about, consider hiring an attorney is number one. If you try to go it alone, it could cost you money in the long run. And the other thing too is I will say that most, having worked in oil and gas all my career and on the other side for operator, they want to do the right thing, but yes, they're running a business, right? So they want to strike a mutually beneficial deal that'll allow them to develop your acreage that in an economic fashion, which is important for you. You don't want to screw them, because if you make it so restrictive that they can't drill, well, then you're never going to get a royalty check, because they're going to say, well, we can't meet the terms of this lease. It's too restrictive. It's not economic for us to do it. So there's a balance, right? So you have to think about, your ultimate goal. And if you hopefully want to see some sort of recurring revenue from your minerals, drilling a well and a producing well is the way that that's done. And so you want to make it such you protect your interest. You have competent advisors that help you get the best lease possible. And on the flip side, that you allow them to have the flexibility to be able to drill that well and produce it. And then it could be a really good partnership going forward, that you're setting up a legacy again, like we've talked about. And it could be a really positive event for you and your family at the end of the day. And so that's something that, it's not just because 25% is the best that you've seen on Mineral Rights Forum in that county, well, you're going to hold your ground. And then you think about somebody maybe saying, well, you're actually way over on the fringe over here. We don't know if the wells are going to be economic there. We still have to test the spacing in that area. We're not willing to pay top dollar lease for that particular land. But if you want to encourage them to come and drill, you're going to have to it's a give and take. So that's always what you want to consider when you do get that lease offer on the table. Go from there.
And I think to that effect, Matt, too, when the landman's reaching out to you, don't be afraid to really treat that landman as a person and have a conversation with them. Pose these questions to them as why they're not offering a higher royalty rate or why they're not able to. Because the landman's going to know more about that specific well in that situation than probably anybody else you could speak to.
No, that's a great point. I think you can ask a lot of questions, and sometimes they'll give you that information to help you understand this scenario. And they're, like you said, they're people too, so you got to treat them with respect, no matter what. I think that's just a kind of a values thing, but and I think that they will reciprocate if you approach them with a position of knowledge, and they see you're knowledgeable, you've done your homework, you're respectful, you're responsive. So that I think that's another big thing is if you want the best deal. There's negotiating tips you can find on the internet to sort of give you some help if you haven't done it before. There's different ways you can help with some of the soft skills that will help your position and when you go to the negotiating table.
Agreed. I think that was a great recap, Matt.
All right. Thanks again for your time, Justin. As always, thanks for your help, and we'll be talking again here soon. And like we mentioned last episode, we will be coming up and talking about title defects and curative measures here in an upcoming episode, estate planning. So please stay tuned and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us an honest rating and review. We read every one of them and sincerely appreciate any feedback you have. And to ask any questions to be featured on an upcoming episode, please leave a comment at mineralrightspodcast.com, or you can send an email to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks. Until next time.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.